Hello and welcome to the Weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. We are brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, NAMO. I'm your host Richard Thomas, Senior Editor Naval, and on the show this week, we head to the site of the Singapore Airshow where Tony Skinner, VP Content, and Gordon Arthur, esteemed Asia-Pacific Editor, give us a run-through of some of the highlights from the week. Tom Withington, academic journalist and expert in radar and EW technologies, returns for part 2 of his analysis into global capabilities, this time focusing on the threat from China and possible countermeasures. And our sponsor NAMO provides this week's Industry Voice. But first, it's time for the weekly news roundup hosted this week by Ben Vogel, news editor, who is joined by Tim Martin, air editor, and Flavia Camargas Pereira, land reporter. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. One of the biggest stories we've covered this week is the fiscal year 2021 budget request from the US Department of Defense. I'm here with Tim Martin and Flavia Camargas Pereira to delve a little bit deeper. So, Tim, what stands out from an Air Force perspective?
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think probably first and foremost, I should say there's probably nothing too surprising about what the DoD are looking for, requesting in terms of our assets. So for just to kind of start at the top with the numbers, for example, there's 57 billion going to be spent on aircraft procurement, aircraft research and design, spares and support equipment, and that's kind of 800 million less than last year. So comparatively speaking, very similar, but also very similar along procurement lines, with a kind of heavy focus on 5th generation and 4th generation fighter jets in particular. So the F-35 program, for example, there's going to be 79 platforms requested at a cost of 11.4 billion. And again, that compares to 98 requested last year. So just a quick breakdown of what's being requested on that program. For example, there's 40 of the 79, 48 are set to be requested for the US Air Force, 10 for the Marine Corps, and then 21 for the US Navy.
And is there a continuing fallout from the removal of Turkey from the F-35 program?
Yeah, that's quite possibly one of the most striking areas that's mentioned within the US Navy's documents, budget documents here, because in the summary of that program itself, the Navy, they have confirmed that there will be higher prices incurred. So if we step back to maybe July, I think, of last year, when the US DoD were talking about unwinding Turkey was the term that they'd used. Now we're kind of seeing the full effects of the decision to remove Turkey. And lo and behold, it is going to be more expensive. And so there is no specific numbers in terms of how much overall that the net losses incurred here, or net expenses rather, I should say, and I think also that probably hampers this whole idea from Lockheed Martin that they have consistently said that the unit price will drop. And sorry, I should say that's not to say that the language of Lockheed Martin is a mistake or anything like that, but it should definitely be said here that there's a big consequence financially from the removal of Turkey from the program itself.
And speaking of fighter aircraft, outside the United States, there is planning work underway in the UK on Tempest with some European partners, and on mainland Europe with FCAS. Does the budget reflect any preliminary planning in the States towards a 6th generation?
It does, yeah. So the US Air Force program, the Next Generation Air Dominance, has been afforded $1 billion. So the Air Force have talked about this, or gone so far as to say that potentially that program would look to have various fighters manufactured in 5-year stints. So not slightly, but radically different almost from what FCAS and Tempest are doing, because they have a roadmap out to 2035, 2040 for production. But here, this would kind of almost change the face of fighter jet programs in the US, insofar as there would be combined manufacturing ongoing. How that rolls out is difficult, I think, to say at this stage, because if you're going to have cooperative programs in place whereby, say, for example, Boeing and Lockheed Martin are involved in manufacturing a small set of fighters for 5 years and then again for 5 years, then what does that mean for the base of Boeing, for example, because this is going to be a successor to the F-22 Raptor program initially. So, when you're going from kind of large scale projects and then reducing down to potentially smaller batches every 5 years. I think there's quite a big question mark on that one. But I'm sure the US Air Force have the answers.
We'll have to wait and see. But it's not all good news on the funding front, is it, Tim?
No, it's not. So, journalists, I think there's a bit of a feeding frenzy that goes on whenever there's budget, and particularly with the US, because, they're so influential in terms of their military might. And first off, everyone looks for who are the winners and losers from this. And I wouldn't so much as to say that the P8 Poseidon, the MPA program, is a loser in this, but it does look like that an unfunded requirement for an additional 18 aircraft is either axed or is frozen, because the 120 aircraft in that program of record, the status is confirmed. But in 2018, the US Navy, as I said, had gained approval for this extra 18 aircraft. But lo and behold, from FY2021, the budget request here, there's no inclusion or no mention of that. So the current status of that, again, there's a bit of a question mark over that one. But certainly that's maybe one that stands out to me.
And there are certain programs that are going to be phased out, or they fall by the wayside.
That's right. So the US Air Force are going to retire 17 1B bombers. Sorry, easy for me to say. So there'll be 45 left in the inventory there, and then there'll be a retirement of some older KC-135 and KC-10 tankers. And then maybe if we just a quick note on the unmanned side. So the MQ-25 Stingray tanker, they'll go into initial rate production in FY 2023. And between now and then, the big focus will be on research and development. I think it was last year that the maiden flight was held for the Stingray.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tim. Moving on to the land domain, Flavia. Which areas of spending is the US Army focusing on in fiscal year 2021?
Basically, Ben, the US Army is focused on lethality and long-term sustainable readiness. Basically, they focus, the main area in this budget is vehicles, is related to vehicles. And for the next year, the US Army should receive 4,500 vehicles.
And can you sort of break that down into vehicle types?
Basically, they will be in 4 types. The ACV, amphibious combat vehicles. It will replace the AAV-7, and the US budget included 72 units, and this is basically it will have improved survivability. Also, the AMPV, 32 units will be delivered in the next year, and the AMPV, it provides a higher level of protection and also more mobility. In addition, there will be investments to upgrade the M1 Abrams tanks. 89 units probably would receive modifications and upgrades, and it will add several electronic upgrades and also a new armor layout. But basically, the largest amount of vehicles, they will be the Joint Light Tactical Vehicles.
And which vehicle does a JLTV replace, Flavia?
Yeah, the JLTV, it will replace the High Mobility Multipurpose Wheeled Vehicle. It's currently in service on the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps. And basically, for the next year, the land force, the ground forces, they receive 400 2,047 vehicles.
That's quite a lot. Missile defence also receives some attention in the FY2021 budget request. Can you elaborate on some of the missile programs in the budget?
For the ground systems, more than 20 billion will be used for missile defeat and defense. It included on this amount homeland defense and next generation interceptors, and also the terminal high altitude area defense with T-8AAD, and in addition, also modifications and upgrades on the Patriot, the PAC-3.
Okay, and meanwhile, also in the United States, the OMFV Bradley replacement project, it looks like it might be rising from the dead. Can you explain more about this resurrection, Flavia?
It's exactly what you said. The U.S. Army formally restarted the program. There is a market survey opened now, and the U.S. Army is waiting for industry feedback and pattern ships just to create the best requirements, just to receive feedback from the industry, how to build this program in a better way. And
what is the U.S. Army doing differently this time as opposed to before?
Yeah, basically, the U.S. Army at the first moment, they had a lot of requirements, and basically the industry wasn't able to offer this. And in January, the U.S. Army has canceled the OMFV solicitation because only one bid was received in the competition. It was from the General Dynamics Land Systems, but it was only one, and the U.S. Army was waiting for more companies and industries interested on take part on this project. Basically, now the U.S. Army revisits the program, the requirements, and the strategies. And the intention is to reorder the OMFV in a competitive basis.
And finally, how many previous attempts have been made to replace the Bradley? Because I understand this isn't the first time. OMFV isn't the first time of trying.
So basically, this is the fourth time, and we are following this story, and we really expect it works now.
Okay, so maybe it will be fourth time lucky. Thank you very much, Flavia. It's worth mentioning that our DoD budget request coverage doesn't neglect the US Navy. A story from our naval editor, Richard Thomas, describes investment in fiscal year 2021 of $19.3 billion to procure 10 new battle force and unmanned ships. And there is also an emphasis on other kind of unmanned systems. RFPs for unmanned programs such as the large unmanned surface vessel and medium unmanned surface vessel were released in 2019, with the expectation that initial funding for the large USV would come from FY 2021 proposals. Development of a larger number of unmanned systems also ties in with the notion of distributed lethality that is driving so much of US military doctrine. The United States is wary of the risks associated with operating a smaller number of high-value and high-capability units against multi-layered threats from China and Russia's interpretation of hybrid warfare, Richard writes. For more information on all of these stories, links will be included in the show notes, or see the Shephard Media website. And now, back to you, Richard.
Coming up next, it's off to the Singapore Airshow, where with a number of companies choosing to stay away due to the ongoing novel coronavirus crisis, Tony and Gordon have dug a little deeper to bring you what's hot in the region's defence sector.
While the podcast is a newer venture for Shephard Media, We've actually been in the defence publishing business for almost 40 years and have built up a strong and loyal audience base. Our content is trusted and consumed by key decision makers through Shephard Media's multiple channels. One benefit of having such a dedicated audience base is our ability to offer a comprehensive range of message delivery options to our advertisers. From brand awareness campaigns across a combination of print and digital media, through targeted email campaigns or show dailies, to a multitude of online opportunities, or even advertising opportunities within the podcast itself. If you'd like to know more, please visit shepherdmedia.com/advertising.
So we are here at the Singapore Airshow 2020, which has been eventful, perhaps for all the wrong reasons. The coronavirus has cast a long shadow over the show this year. But we've been here all week. There has been some news out and about. I'm here with Gordon Arthur, who's our Asia Pacific editor.
Hi there.
And Ilke Aktosoglu, who's our air analyst.
Hi.
So guys, just to sort of set the scene for the listeners, it has been an interesting event. We knew in advance that a number of companies had pulled out. Obviously, the Chinese aren't here because of travel restrictions, but then some of the major primes also didn't attend, so the likes of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Bell, Honeywell, Leonardo. There's a number of empty stands as you look around for those companies that may be cancelled before the actual build happens. So unless you're familiar with their perhaps actual stand design, there's no telling who they were. And also, obviously, a lack of visitors. So it's been a relatively quiet show in terms of footfall. I mean, just to, what were some of your initial impressions, guys, sort of coming here, under this sort of the shadow of the coronavirus?
Yeah, Tony, I just feel like the show has been decimated. It's been very, very quiet. Very few people coming. As you say, a lot of the big companies didn't bother turning up. So it has been very quiet. There have been positives about this too, though, Tony. For example, you don't have to queue up at the security checks. And even more importantly, when you leave, you don't have to queue up for a taxi.
It wouldn't be the Singapore Airshow without our 2-hour taxi queue is my attitude. But being able to sort of step out of air conditioning and straight into an air-conditioned cab has been great. I guess we must say that the organisers have been taking preventative measures for those that have attended. We've had a temperature screened as we come in. There is hand sanitisers everywhere. I guess not everybody, but a lot of people sort of wearing masks. When we do visit stands, often it is easy to find the person you need. They do have time to talk to us as journalists because perhaps there isn't as much sort of going on. Ilke, you're a little bit newer to the circuit. I guess this will be one of the quieter shows that you've seen.
I think this was the really quiet show that I have seen compared to other shows like Max in Moscow or Paris Airshow or Farnborough. This was really, really quiet. And also I have seen really less static aircraft on the static display. So this was, I think, another point I could mention.
That is a good point. Normally the static displays are relatively full of aircraft. Really, we only had the Americans, the Singaporeans, and the Malaysians, I guess.
And there's a couple of Thai aircraft too. But, as you say, very few aircraft.
I didn't get a chance to see the Chinese team flying, but they, I guess it must be noted also that they were here.
Yeah, the Chinese brought their Ba-Yi aerobatic team, and I think there's a bit of consternation between the Americans and the Chinese, the fact that they both have their advanced fighters parked in close proximity to each other at the nearby Changi Air Base.
So, I'm sure, a whole story there to be told. Let's sort of pivot a little bit and look at what news, there was out there. Ilke, one thing that from the rotorcraft side, there was the Bell 412 EPX, which is a Bell Subaru joint venture. So you went out and had a look at the aircraft.
Yeah, actually on the static display, while the Japanese MOD is trialing the new utility helicopter since February last year, there was a civilian version of it, which is Bell Subaru 412 EPX. So it was in, of course, green color this time, even if it's military civilian aircraft. So we could see this one, but also there was a 10% scale of the new Japanese utility helicopter on the Subaru booth. So we could have a look how it looks like.
And I guess the other thing that was notable in terms of their, being sort of new aircraft, new platforms, was the presence of the Heron 2, which we'd covered before the show. Our Israeli correspondent sort of picked that one up. I guess a very similar platform, but with enhanced capabilities.
Actually, Heron is coming in wider and longer fuselage, which is allowing it to carry larger payloads, which is almost 470 kilograms. So this has some better capabilities.
Yeah, I think one thing about the Heron 2, obviously with the enhanced performance, it is a little bit of an evolution, better range, better altitude, I think. But also the fact that it has a better satellite communications link. So it is able to operate further from the ground control station. And yeah, the company's highlighting the fact that sort of extends the mission range and how the actual aircraft can be utilised. And that's based on, I guess, operator feedback.
And also now it can reach to up to 35,000 feet altitude. Mm-hmm. And additionally, it can carry 470 kilograms payload with its wider fuselage.
So yeah, I guess a significant enhancement on that side. Gordon, just to turn to you, we were excited to see that there was the first Singaporean MRTT out on the static display, so first chance to see that aircraft.
Yeah, we were quite ecstatic to see this, Tony, because it's nice to actually see something new here for a change. There was one on display. I believe 6 have actually all been delivered by Airbus now to the Republic of Singapore Air Force. And there was an announcement yesterday at the show saying that Singapore will be cooperating with Airbus on a smart aerial refueling capability.
What does that mean?
Well, it means when the aircraft comes along to receive fuel, a lot of the process will become automated. So the giving of fuel, etc., will happen automatically. So the boom operator just sort of oversees and monitors things. So flight tests have already begun on this. Australia did some experimentation, but Singapore is going to be sort of the lead customer. It's giving one of its aircraft to this program to develop this smart air-to-air refueling capability.
And in terms of, we come to air shows, other trade shows, we're always looking out for new contracts, new delivery announcements. I guess one notable one at what was a quiet show was the news that Thailand's buying the H135M.
Yes, new contracts have been extremely slow, certainly on the defence side. So this was a piece of news that we could get our teeth into. The Royal Thai Air Force is buying 6 H135 helicopters. So these are going to be used particularly for training. And even though the deal was announced here at the show in February, the deal actually happened late last year. So first delivery, I think, from memory, was going to be next year. I do have to say, Tony, this is quite hilarious. Thailand has a helicopter type from just about every manufacturer in the world. The Thai military has Russian helicopters, it has Leonardo helicopters, it has Bell helicopters, it has Sikorsky helicopters, and it has Airbus. They don't have the H135 so far, so of course it's nice to add this to their collection.
So yeah, helicopters aren't being launched quickly enough for the Thai Army, Thai MOD to be purchasing them. When we hear about the advantages of commonality, the advantages of common platforms doing different missions, the mind boggles the number of different types that one country operates. I can't think of anybody else with such a diverse fleet. If listeners want to get in touch and correct us on that, I think Thailand probably takes the cake on that one.
Yeah, I have had people on Twitter saying that perhaps India would be a close competitor for Thailand in terms of the helicopter fleet. But of course, India doesn't have Leonardo helicopters.
In terms of the local presence, obviously ST Engineering's the major or the only big defence company here in Singapore. As usual, they had a huge stand and lots of new capabilities. I guess the Hunter vehicle was one notable addition. We had a chat with the head of their land division about this, he was really highlighting the fact that, so it's a very capable armoured vehicle itself, but it's based around the digital architecture, given that how much things like artificial intelligence, data processing plays a part in operations, being able to incorporate that digital architecture from the ground up was a real advantage. Gordon, I know that you spent some time on the stand. I mean, anything else notable from ST Engineering?
Yeah, I'm glad ST Engineering was here because they sort of saved the day. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an awful lot to write about. So there were 2 or 3 new products that I took an interest in. One of them was called the SRAMS, which is the Super Rapid Advanced Mortar System. So they actually unveiled the Mark II version. So this is a 120 millimeter mortar system. It's auto-loader. And the difference between a Mark I and a Mark II, it has an all-electric drive system. So this permits 360-degree rotation. And also the other advantage is when it's stowed, it can be stowed almost horizontally compared to the Mark I version. So that was a new product, and that was mounted in the back of a Bronco 3 tracked vehicle. ST Engineering also had a couple of new UAVs that they're developing in cooperation with the DSO National Laboratories. So these are vertical takeoff and landing UAVs. This is the first time we've seen those in terms of fixed-wing hybrid UAVs. So they have 2 different types, one with an approximately 15 kg payload and one with an approximately 60 kg payload. So these are called the Veloce 15 and the Veloce 60 respectively. And one other item worth noting, Tony, was a new 40 millimeter grenade round. Now, ST Engineering makes grenade launchers, it makes the grenade ammunition, but they've now developed a special round that you can use against interloping UAVs. So it can be fired from a rifle-mounted launcher, and you aim it at the UAV, and when it detonates, it releases basically party streamers, so long, thin strips of plastic, and these strips of plastic foul the rotor blades and cause it to tumble to the ground. They also have another version, which is sort of a mounted machine gun type version with laser rangefinder and electro-optics, so it's a lot more accurate. So that's another way of countering UAVs.
So yeah, in terms of that counter UAV mission, we've seen lasers, we've seen nets being thrown over. I guess party streamers is a new approach to that problem. Guys, we're running out of time, but any sort of final thoughts about your impressions of the show?
The last point from my side, I know that Singapore is focusing a lot on the eco side of the things. So we have seen companies handing out recycled water bottles, metal pipes for many use. And actually this was matching our move from print edition to digital edition. So I think this was a good place to start.
So yeah, that's worth noting that from a company perspective, we were pushing the fact that although we do have print magazines here, you can now sign up for the free app and get all the access digitally. And our print run was kind of limited to the show. Perhaps not as many visitors to sign up as we would have liked, but that's kind of the nature of the show this year.
So, Tony, that leads us to ask the question, what will happen to the upcoming Asian shows after seeing how Singapore Airshow has been affected?
So, yeah, just this morning we've seen a number of shows around the world cancelled outright. The Grand Prix, Formula One have had their events cancelled. The big mobile phone event in Barcelona, I think, that news this morning, that was cancelled. We have DSA in April, I believe, and that's the next in terms of how we make a living. Our bread and butter is attending these events. That's the next major one regionally. A little bit of time, I guess, perhaps to make a call on that, but it'll be curious to see if they are able to push ahead with that one. For all the news from the Singapore Airshow, please do visit our website. But for now, just to say thanks to Gordon.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Orca.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The history of the helicopter is the story of a few key individuals that were able to overcome the technical challenges that made vertical flight possible. Those early pioneers created rotorcraft that would transform, enrich, and ultimately save lives.
Anything that one man can imagine, other men will make real.
He was the real pioneer of rotary wing aircraft, no two ways about it.
He wanted to apply that technique, and I wanted to apply my technique of working with my hands and getting something that operated.
I had no idea that anyone could build a heavier-than-air flying machine that could have all that freedom of flight. And it made me an absolute convert for life.
Welcome to Shephard Studios' Revolutions in Vertical Flight, sponsored by our partner, Bell. Over the course of 6 episodes, we will look at the history of vertical flight and discover the key individuals and revolutionary moments that created the rotorcraft industry that we know today. And we will take a look to the future. Consider how next-generation rotorcraft will shape the future battle space, and hear how innovation underway today will enable the urban air mobility of tomorrow.
One of the first trademarks of an innovator is to see opportunity where people don't see it yet.
It's definitely changing the way the warfighter fights and saving people's lives. So.
But if either A or B do not have a runway, then tilt rotor is definitely an option.
We are committed to helping build the foundation for eVTOL, and that's not about one winner, it's about having many winners.
That's Revolutions in Vertical Flight. The full series is available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Withington, who, as I outlined earlier, is going to give us a run-through of the threat environment in the Asia-Pacific region and what can be done about it. Tom, welcome back to the Weekly Defence Podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Richard. It's always good to catch up with yourselves and always nice to chat about EW too.
Absolutely. So listen, I took in your paper at the recent ADEX event in Singapore, which detailed some of the threats faced by the US, NATO and other sort of allied forces operating in that region. It seems China has a missile capability that is second to none. What's your take on that?
It's an interesting question because I suppose one of the vexing issues with this is that we've not had the opportunity to see China's latest anti-ship missiles in combat effectively. What we have seen so far in terms of Chinese missiles that have been used against ships is mainly the use of legacy systems like Silkworm, etc., used by Hezbollah or by the Houthi rebels who've been or currently involved in Yemen's civil war. So there's a disconnect between the advertised capabilities of the missiles that are now coming on stream in the People's Liberation Army Navy and also elsewhere in the Chinese armed forces with what we've seen in the operating environment. On paper, the missiles look especially lethal and especially capable. And I think there's no reason not to take those claims seriously because even if the missiles fall short of their advertised capabilities, it's always better, arguably, to prepare for a more serious threat than the one you might end up facing, because obviously it's a hell of a lot better doing that than getting those two things the wrong way round. So I think the Chinese do talk a very good game, and I think there's a very good reason to take their technology seriously. Regrettably, I feel that we'll only ever truly ascertain how good the kit is in a conflict, and that's obviously something that nobody wants to get involved in if at all possible.
So, as you say, if we sort of take at face value China's seemingly very impressive capability in the missile domain, and maybe if it might have the capability to deny access to US Navy and other forces operating in the South and East China Seas, if we take that as a given, what capabilities does US, NATO and other allies have at their disposal in electronically countering such a capability? How viable do you think the US and other forces countermeasures are against this proposed Chinese threat?
Well, you raise an excellent point, because this is really one of the intangibles. If you take the US Navy as an example, they're currently engaged in an overarching modernization of their surface electronic warfare capabilities, and that's mainly occurring through the SLQ-32, known as the SLIC-32 Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program, and that's really overhauling the primary jammer and electronic support measure that the US naval surface fleet uses. And really what that's doing is that's taking a legacy system and hugely upgrading it and ensuring that it's suitable for 21st century naval conflict. Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, in the Asia-Pacific region, you've got a variety of capabilities. You've got everything from the kind of electronic warfare capabilities that you see on Japanese or Korean or Singaporean naval vessels, Australian naval vessels, for instance, that are highly advanced and really can be considered at the top of their game, right down to sort of lower tier navies that perhaps haven't invested in EW as much as they should and are still dealing with EW capabilities on their vessels that are configured for legacy threats. So there's a huge variety of capabilities that are there. And what's interesting about EW in the naval context, particularly in the Asia-Pacific, is as far as the missiles are concerned, this really fulfills sort of part of the response. The other parts of the response that you would need during any conflict is also to obviously kinetically engage those missiles. So air-to-ground or surface-to-surface attacks against the batteries that are firing them, against the warships that are firing them. And the other aspect that links into that is also the intelligence battle. You need to know exactly what you're facing and where those threats are before they become apparent. And that's from both from a physical point of view and from electronics. So you need the electronic intelligence. You need to ensure that your electronic orders of battle are absolutely up to date, that you have a really good idea of what's out there, you have a really good idea of how the radars work on those missiles, but also physically you know what's going on. So when we talk about, I think, EW in the naval context in the Asia-Pacific, we need to see it firstly from an equipment point of view. We need to also see it from an electronic intelligence point of view. And then the third element I'd add is training. I think an imperative in that part of the world is that the allied navies and the US Navy understand how their counterparts do EW and train regularly on that so that the doctrines mesh nicely, everybody knows what everyone else is doing, and that can help reduce the threat posed by these missiles in the event of a conflict.
Can the physical side of things react fast enough as sort of capabilities get that much more advanced, both in sort of operating in the MS domain, but also in the physical domain? Can a human operator classify and react fast enough to a threat, or is there a move to see much of the kind of deterrent actions that need to be taken to counter a threat? Is that moving into the realms of machine learning and AI?
I think AI is becoming crucially important particularly in naval EW. It's becoming important in air electronic warfare as well. Yeah. Precisely for the points that you've just raised, the speed of the threats now are truly eye-watering. The DF-100, China's latest anti-ship cruise missile, has an advertised hypersonic velocity of sort of Mach 5 and above, 3,333 knots, that is. That is hugely significant if you cast your mind back to the early 1980s when we had the Falklands War. Obviously, we had the threat that we had the cost that the Exocet missile was capable of exacting on the Royal Navy. You were dealing with a subsonic threat there, I think around about the sort of 700 knots mark for that weapon as it was at the time. And this gives you an idea that is the human brain capable of thinking, getting around the OODA loop at a suitable speed to defeat that missile? My feeling is if AI is coming on stream and can be embraced, then it should be embraced in the naval EW context, because this could provide the difference between life and death for a warship. But fortunately, I think a lot of navies get that. I think there's the interest that's going on. One point I'd add about AI is I think also we need to do a bit of expectation management. There is the interest going on, there's the investment that's going into it, but we also need to realise it's not coming next Thursday. We may still have to wait a few years before we can really harness AI in that context. So that goes back to the point I made previously, that therefore we need to keep sharp with other things, the legacy EW systems, the training and the LN.
What about limitations then? Because if we're talking about sort of the cyber domain and digital kind of things, are there limitations to how many connections or how much data can you cram into the digital space? Is there a limit to it? Big data will play a hugely important role in AI in the naval context, because
you're dealing with sophisticated radar threats that have electronic countermeasure capabilities on. They have very sophisticated waveforms. So you've got to collect all of this data, and in many ways your EW response is only as good as the data you put in, and that data is only as good as the electronic support measures that you have collecting it and the analytics that you do. And again, this is another place where big data where AI rather comes in. We talked a little bit about it now in the naval EW context into the countermeasure, but we also need to start thinking about using big data at the ELINT level. So we're getting in these thousands and thousands of records, these thousands of little tidbits of information here and there. How do we crunch that all? And AI has a really important role to play in that, in helping. We're not saying get rid of the naval ELINT operators, because these people are worth their weight in gold. They're absolutely crucial. But how can we make their job easier? Crucially, how can we make the information as accurate as possible, this huge amount of information, so that once it gets down to the tip of the spear to the navies, it is the right stuff at the right moment for the right threat.
Yeah. So back end of last year, I sat in on a speech given by a senior US military official who said that the EMS side of things, cyber and digital domains, were essentially, he called now, and he was sort of relating to the supposed threat from China, that these domains were the first frontier in which conflict will be fought. So given that sort of digital cyber and everything with it encompass land, sea and air, do you agree that this is the case, and are forces newly adapting to this threat, or is it something that's been going on for a long period of time?
If you lose the spectrum, you lose the battle. And if you lose the battle, you risk losing the war. So I think the role of the electromagnetic spectrum writ large is as important as it's ever been, and is likely to become even more important in the future. And I think that's driven by two things. It's driven by the electromagnetic threat we see from these missiles, from the battle management and communications networks that opposing forces are using to get around the OODA loop and to turn their intent into maneuver. And the other aspect to that is the cyber aspect as well. I'm always a little bit hesitant to merge cyber and EW into the same bucket, if you like, because they do relate to each other. They're neighbours rather than housemates, I would say. They have their own unique attributes, but they do both depend on the spectrum to a point. So, yeah, it is highly important. I think it's always been important, to be fair. I think since the earliest days of the spectrum being used en masse in warfare. I mean, I'm going back to a bit of a pet subject of mine, which is Bomber Command during the Second World War, which, I mean, I could prattle on for days about, but fortunately, we only have a finite amount of time.
Sadly, yeah.
But the thing about Bomber Command during World War II was they started to realise from about 1942 onwards that really, if they don't master the spectrum, they're going to lose a lot of bombers on ops night after night. And then I think that just continued. But I think the thing that now that's so important is that the tools we've got, the things you and I have talked about just now about big data and analytics and cognitive EW and all of these things, the tools that are now coming on stream enable us to do things that the SIGINT experts and the EW experts in Korea or in World War II or even the Falklands, we're now living in their utopia in a way. This is what they would have dreamed of, having these kind of capabilities. So in short, it's always been important, but now we have even more ability to really harness the spectrum and to use it to our advantage. But we need to remember, of course, we ain't going to be the only ones doing it. Our adversaries will be as well. And that's something that we have to be very cognizant of.
Very wise, Tom. Thank you very much for your time in joining us on the Weekly Defence Podcast. Thank you.
My pleasure, Richard. Thanks very much.
So this part of the show is what we call Industry Voice. This is the part of the show that's brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Namo. On the line, I have regular contributor Andre Lons, who's the SVP of Communications for Namo. So good morning, Andre.
Morning, Tony.
So, interesting one this week. You've been at the Air Power conference in Norway. Mm-hmm. I understand it was about 300 or 400 people in attendance. Mm-hmm. Obviously, to sort of chat through today's challenges. Mm-hmm. But yeah, some interesting takeaways. So maybe just to kick off, what have you been hearing over the period of the conference?
Yeah, I did attend the airport seminar here in Trondheim, which is an annual event here that they've been holding now since the early 90s. And the topic this time was Norwegian joint air operations and strategy to task or task to strategy. And what struck me throughout the conference was just how transferable and recognizable those key challenges were to, I think, anyone in the defense sector. For instance, strategy to task or task to strategy. In other words, are you adapting your strategy to the tasks or adapting the tasks to the strategy you have? And I think everyone can feel some recognition of those words, because how often don't we think that, okay, this is our strategy for next year, this is what we want to do, but then real life sets in and all of a sudden you have to deal with this thing and this thing and this thing. And when do you have time then to work on the new things you're going to do that are going to bring you forward and be like your key strategy? I think you see that probably in journalism as well as you do in business, in industry.
Certainly. So how much does sort of strategy influence what we do in the day-to-day?
Yeah.
How much is the strategy then conversely has to change? Yeah. So any conclusions out of that?
And the thing is that, I think they didn't actually conclude as much as they said, well, this is just the world we live in, and we're because they can't ignore day-to-day tasks. The political overlords are always going to have the final say on what they're going to spend their time on, and just the world around them is changing so fast that expecting to be able to stick to strategy all the time is not going to be possible. But I think they do feel that the pinch in the sense that they wish they can dedicate more time to develop and to implement their strategy as opposed to reacting to world events. And again, I think that's also very recognizable for all of us. The second point that I took away from this is the challenge that as we get more and more technology and more insight into what's going on, there's a temptation for increased micromanagement, or at least to maintain the kind of micromanagement that perhaps we've developed in recent years. So that if you take an F-35, for instance, there were F-35 pilots speaking at the conference saying that the tools at their disposal now are so much greater than they had when they had the F-16. So the pilot out there can actually do a lot of the on-the-spot planning or make decisions on the spot that traditionally would have to go way up the chain, because they have so much more information and they have so much more insight into what's going on. And that you're basically hamstringing a incredible resource if you're forcing it back into the kind of planning cycles and mission planning cycles that previous generations of aircraft will have to adhere to. And the interesting thing is that after he had finished, an Army Brigadier General came up and said pretty much the same thing. Like, yep, that's actually quite recognizable there too. Their platoon commanders have so many more tools at their disposal now than they used to have themselves, and hence they can make more decisions. And again, I see this is a universal and transferable challenge to the world of business that I think as we develop more and more tools, and people at different levels of the organization develop more tools, we have to resist the temptation for micromanagement, because otherwise we're hamstringing our people and limiting them from implementing and taking full advantage of them. So that there has to be a level of trust and delegation of authority to lower levels of leadership that we haven't really seen. I mean, it's not a new idea. U.S. played with the idea of like the strategic corporal, and back in the 90s and so on. That was the idea that network centricity would allow. But the tendency has rather been to micromanage more and to become sort of risk averse. You don't want to trust, you don't put the trust down there. But I think as technology continues to improve, that push is going to grow. And we have to, a little bit as Stan McChrystal says, you have to eyes on but hands off on the resources down in the field, because otherwise you're not going to be able to succeed.
I mean, it's the classic. The analogy is that the general in the command center watching the predator feed for hours and hours, just because he can. Yeah. Just because the technology allows you to do that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best. The best way to approach things.
No, and even if he does, he should resist the temptation then to to actually act on it, but rather trust that there are other people seeing this as well that are closer to the action, who actually are responsible for taking action. And if he sees that that they don't see the full picture, then he has to intervene, but not before. It has to be very sparingly applied. And again, in the world of business, I think we have to also limit the temptation to intervene constantly when we do see that, maybe I would have done something different here. Just because modern reporting systems or technology allows us to. There is a push from owners, investors, boards to do so, but I think it's also lies on us then as leaders in these businesses to push back and say, actually, long term, if we start down that route, we're only going to stifle ourselves in an incredibly top-heavy bureaucracy of micromanagement and bottlenecks that are not going to be sustainable. We're seeing it on the military side, and I think we're seeing it on the business side. And this conference, to me, kind of drove it home how universal that challenge really is.
And obviously the flip side of all this in a military context is, and we heard a lot about this at the Air and Space Power Conference here in London last year, when they talked about the idea of multi-domain operations and preparing, for today's threats, is that there was a lot of comments about, okay, so how do you, in today's EW environment, how would you operate in a GPS communications degraded or denied environment, in which case you obviously want people in the grounds, the guys in the air, to be able to make those decisions without having the connectivity that they might be used to today.
Exactly. And the pilot also highlighted that during his talk, that we have to expect that things will go black at some point. We will lose some sort of connectivity at some point. And if you then have the kind of tool that you have available with an F-35, for instance, out in the field, and the pilot is not empowered to take action when he sees that, okay, here is what whatever threat is generating this sort of denied environment right now, here's what they're trying to do. They're trying to exploit the situation right now by doing this. And that means that they need to have then the authority and the training and the trust to take action to then deny the opponent the advantage that they potentially have gained by creating this denied environment. And I think that's another big challenge that's coming up, is that, the counter reaction to someone trying to create confusion is to have people on your own side empowered and able to create the same.
So fascinating topic. Obviously, a lot of universal challenges there. Organizations clearly need to be agile, need to be reactive.
Absolutely.
Need to keep the bigger strategy in mind despite all that. And the world is changing really quickly. And, that, I guess that, as you say, that applies both to the military, to industry, and certainly to us on the publishing side. So,
absolutely. Yeah, I think it's quite universal.
Andra, thanks for your time again. Always a pleasure. Speak to you soon.
This episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast was brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Namo. As always, a big thanks to everyone that took the time in being a part of the episode. And for our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe and leave a review on iTunes, and tell a friend or a colleague about the podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening.